My name is Dela Morrison, and I'm 63 years old. I always thought I'd lived long enough to know what true exhaustion felt like. Losing my husband was the hardest pain I've ever faced, and along with it came medical bills that kept me awake at night. I thought nothing could wear me down more than that. But I was wrong. The worst didn't come from outside. It came from within my own family, and that's what still pains me to remember. The way I was treated by my own son and his wife. After my husband died, I wanted to ensure Randall, my only son, had a stable life. I gave him the house I'd lived in for so many years, already paid off. I thought I was giving him security, a home where he could raise his family without worry. I never imagined that, just a few months later, I myself would be forced to pay to sleep in the room that had once been his when he was a boy. $5,000 a month. That's what Randall and his wife, Oilia, charged me to stay there. The first time I heard that price, I thought it was a joke. I laughed nervously, hoping he'd say he was joking, but he didn't. Oilia stood nearby with that cold demeanor and confirmed the price as if she were talking to a random tenant. I felt betrayed. It was my home, the same one where I'd seen my son take his first steps, and now I had to pay like a stranger. My heart ached more than my wallet. To make that money, I took on 3 jobs at once. In the mornings, I'd work at the supermarket restocking shelves. In the afternoons, I'd go to people's homes to clean. At night, I'd work at a restaurant, washing dishes and waiting tables when needed. I'd come home exhausted, my body aching, my hands cracked from all the cleaning products. But I'd take a deep breath and keep going. I told myself it would only be until things stabilized, but that until never arrived. Meanwhile, Randall and Oilia lived comfortably. I never saw them go out to work. They always had new clothes, dined out, and traveled on weekends. I could hear their laughter coming from the living room as I tried to sleep so I could get up at 4 in the morning. It was like living in 2 realities. Me, working myself to death, and them, relaxing without lifting a finger. And all of this sustained by my own efforts. This inequality was eating away at me. The most humiliating moment happened on an ordinary night. I was tired, my hands were shaking, and a plate slipped and fell to the kitchen floor. The noise echoed through the house. Before I could bend down to pick up the pieces, I heard Oilia's voice shouting, "You useless old woman." Those words cut me to the core like nothing else. The worst part wasn't the insult itself, but Randall's silence. My son was there, heard everything, and didn't say a single word to defend me. In that moment, I felt a huge weight inside me. It was as if all the years of dedication, sacrifice, and love had been erased in seconds. I found myself standing motionless, looking at them both, and I realized there was no longer anything tying me to that house. They no longer saw me as a mother, nor as a person. I was merely a resource, a source of money and services. It was at that moment that something inside me began to change. I stayed awake all night, staring at the ceiling of the room that had once been my son's. I remembered him when he was little, the times I'd soothed him when he had a fever, the lunch boxes I'd packed for school, the clothes I'd washed and ironed. I remembered my husband, how we dreamed of leaving something valuable for Randall, and I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried in a long time, but in the midst of my tears, I also felt a surge of strength. I couldn't go on living like this. The next morning, without telling anyone, I grabbed a small suitcase and packed only the essentials, some clothes, documents, my wedding ring, and a framed photo of my husband. That was all I took. I looked at that room one last time, and with a heavy heart, I decided to leave. I didn't leave a note. I didn't give an explanation. I just left. I no longer wanted to live where I wasn't respected. At first, I didn't know where to go. I walked the streets feeling a mix of fear and freedom. I was 63 years old, with few resources and no certainty. But for the first time in a long time, I could breathe without feeling that constant weight on my shoulders. I eventually found a small apartment to rent. It was simple, with peeling walls and a musty smell, but it was my space. For the first time in years, I closed a door, knowing no one would humiliate me inside. At first, it was difficult. I still had medical bills to pay, and of course, I needed to keep working. But even when I came home tired, there was something different. The silence of my small apartment was sweet, not painful. I could sit on the worn sofa, drink cheap tea, and feel at peace. I didn't have to hide my weary sighs. I didn't have to endure judgmental looks. I was alone, yes, but I was free. It was during this period that I began to uncover hidden truths. Through comments from neighbors and acquaintances, I learned that Randall wasn't the stable man I'd thought. He was drowning in gambling debt, losing nearly $90,000. While I was breaking my bank working 3 jobs, he was destroying everything gambling. And Oilia, the one who had called me worthless, not only encouraged him to maintain his illusion, but also had a wealthy lover who financed part of their luxurious lifestyle. This filled me with a mixture of anger and relief. Anger for everything they'd done to me, but relief in realizing that the problem was never me. When I learned about Randall's debts, it hit me hard. I realized it wasn't me who was failing, but he was the one who was lost in his own choices. I remembered all the times he'd borrowed money from me years ago, saying it was for emergencies. Now everything made sense. That money never came back because it was never used for anything concrete. It only fed his addiction. It was painful to face, but at the same time, it opened my eyes. I could no longer blame myself for a problem that wasn't mine. Over time, I also heard about Oilia. An old neighbor bluntly commented, "Your daughter-in-law is parading around with a guy named Marcus, everyone knows." I kept quiet, but inside I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't surprising. Oilia always seemed disinterested in Randall, more concerned with appearances. Learning she was having an affair only confirmed what I already suspected. She never cared about her family, only about the comfort she could extract from others. While they were drowning in lies, I breathed a sigh of relief in my small apartment. No one there called me useless. On the contrary, I met people who treated me with respect from the very first moment. Frank, the landlord, was one of them. A white-haired man with a kind smile. He even helped me fix the door lock for free. He said I reminded him of his sister, who had also been through a lot in her life. This empathy gave me the strength to believe I wasn't alone. Another unexpected source of support came from Sarah, an ex-girlfriend of Randall's whom I happened to run into on the street. She recognized me and made a point of talking. She explained how Randall had shown signs of manipulation and irresponsibility since he was young. She said she broke up with him precisely because she noticed this behavior. Hearing this hurt, but it also served as validation. I wasn't crazy, nor was I making up problems. His behavior had been going on for years, and I had simply turned a blind eye, believing that a mother's love could solve everything. The worst part was learning that, to defend themselves, Randall and Oilia began spreading lies about me. They told family and acquaintances that I was mentally ill, that I no longer knew how to take care of myself, that I needed to be rescued. When I first heard this, my heart nearly stopped. It was complete reversal of reality. I, who had always been lucid and hardworking, was being painted as incapable. It was a hard blow because I realized they would do anything to keep their image intact, but I had already made a decision. I wouldn't back down. I wouldn't be the family's cash cow again. It didn't matter what anyone said about me. I knew who I was, what I'd done, and what I was capable of. That's when I began to put together a kind of protection plan. I made a point of organizing keeping receipts for everything, even keeping medical notes attesting to my mental health. It was my way of shielding myself in case anyone tried to do me more serious harm. During this time, my neighbors were also a huge relief. Some helped me with small favors. Others simply kept me company. In the building, I began to be affectionately called Dona Dela, and that simple recognition was worth a lot. I wasn't invisible there. I was seen, heard, respected. This healed some of the wounds Randall and Oilia had inflicted on me. It was as if I had found a new family, made up of people without blood ties but full of humanity. Still, there were nights when I cried alone. The pain of seeing my own son transform into someone I didn't recognize tightened my chest. I wondered where I went wrong, what I could have done differently. But after much reflection, I understood that every adult chooses their own path. I gave my best, and no one could take that away. What he did with what he was given was no longer my responsibility. This thought was liberating. It was also during this time that I started taking better care of myself. Simple things like buying a plant to decorate the living room, calmly cooking a meal just for myself, or going for an early morning walk. Small gestures that I previously didn't allow myself because I was always too busy serving others. I discovered that I didn't need much to feel good. I just needed to put myself at the center of my own life, and that's something I'd never done before. While I silently rebuilt my world, Randall was falling ever closer to rock bottom. Gambling debts began to pile up, and there was no hiding it anymore. Oilia, meanwhile, was already immersed in her affair with Marcus, using him as a new source of income. That family that seemed so solid on the outside was actually falling apart. And I, who had previously felt like the weakest link, now watched from the sidelines, firmly in my place. One day, Randall showed up at my door. I could hardly believe my eyes, seeing him there, his face drawn, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes red. For the first time in years, I saw my son truly vulnerable. He begged me for help, saying he couldn't take it anymore, that he was lost. I listened to every word in silence and my heart ached, but this time, I wasn't the one who would sacrifice myself to save him. I knew that if I gave in, everything would go back to the way it was before. I took a deep breath and told him I still loved him, that he would always be my son, but that I wouldn't be his savior. I told him the only way to get a second chance was to take responsibility for my mistakes, seek treatment, and truly change. He cried in front of me like he had when he was a child, and I, with tears in my eyes, remained firm. For the first time in my life, I drew a clear line between a mother's love and the need to preserve myself as a woman. Randall left my house that night, shaken, but different. I could tell my words had struck a chord he could no longer deny. For the first time, he didn't argue, didn't accuse me, didn't try to turn things around. He simply lowered his head and accepted that he needed to change. It was painful to see him like that, but also a relief. I knew there were only two paths. Either he could get back on his feet, or he could sink for good, and the choice was his. A few days later, I received news that Randall had enrolled in a gambling addiction recovery program. I was shocked. Part of me doubted he would take it seriously, but another part felt hope. I didn't get directly involved. I didn't offer money. I didn't follow up to monitor him. I simply made it clear that if he truly wanted to change, I would be there to support him morally, but not financially. It was a tough but necessary step. While he underwent treatment, I continued living my new routine. I still worked hard, but the difference was that the money now served only me, paying for my small apartment, buying my own things, making simple choices that previously weren't in my hands. This autonomy brought me a sense of dignity I'd forgotten what it felt like. I felt like I was finally living my life, no longer surviving to support others. During this time, my circle of support grew. Sarah visited me occasionally, bringing news of people who had also cut ties with Randall because of his actions. Frank, the landlord, became a true friend. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch and talk about life, loss, and family. These were simple conversations, but they fulfilled me in a way that living with my son and daughter-in-law never could. I discovered that affection and respect can come from the places we least expect. Little by little, I noticed changes in Randall. When he called me, his voice sounded less arrogant, more humble. He told me about support groups, meetings, stories of other addicts who had helped him see the depths of his own life. I listened silently, feeling a mixture of pain and pride. Pain at knowing how much he'd wasted to get there, but pride because, finally, he seemed to be taking the first steps in the right direction. While Randall was rebuilding himself, Oilia was following a different path. I discovered that Marcus, the wealthy man she was having an affair with, had eventually left her when he realized she only wanted money. Without a husband to support her luxuries, and without a lover, she was left without a foundation. This didn't bring satisfaction, but it did bring justice. She had always treated me like dead weight, and now she was the one facing the weight of her own choices. Each reaps what they sow. I, on the other hand, was beginning to find peace. I made small achievements that felt like victories to me. I managed to pay off one of the last installments of my medical bills, bought a new armchair for my living room, and even adopted a stray cat, which became my daily companion. I named him Lucky because that's how I felt, lucky to have found the strength to change my life. He greeted me at the door every day, and that simple gesture was enough to remind me that I deserved love. There were days when Randall still tried to plead, saying he missed the comfortable life he had. But, to my surprise, he soon acknowledged out loud that it was just an illusion. "Mom, I don't want to be that man again," he once said. Those words moved me deeply, not because they erased the past, but because they showed he was finally looking at himself truthfully. That was a victory in itself. My health also improved. With less emotional burden, I began to sleep better. My back pain lessened, and even my skin seemed clearer. It's amazing how the body responds when the soul finds rest. I discovered that aging doesn't mean surrendering to suffering. It means finding ways to live more lightly. And I only achieved this lightness when I freed myself from exploitation and humiliation. Some people close to me even asked if I wasn't afraid of regretting turning my back on my son at that difficult time. I firmly replied, I didn't turn my back on him. I gave him the chance to stand up for himself. For years, I carried the weight of him and Oilia on my shoulders. It was when I let go of that weight that he could finally see reality. It wasn't a lack of love. It was the hardest and truest form of love. As the months passed, Randall made progress in his recovery. He managed to find a simple job, nothing compared to his previous standard of living, but an honest one. And that was enough. When he told me about his first paycheck and that he hadn't spent a penny on gambling, I felt immense joy. For the first time, I wasn't hearing empty promises, but concrete results. It was a new beginning, both for him and for me. It was during this period that I realized that my greatest victory wasn't just leaving the house, nor facing Randall and Oilia. My true victory was finding myself again. I wasn't just a mother, a widow, woman, I was hers, a whole person, capable of choosing, of saying no, and of building my own peace. This realization was, without a doubt, the most important achievement of my life. The true reunion between Randall and me happened on a Sunday afternoon. He showed up at my apartment with a simple bouquet of flowers, nothing fancy, but full of sincerity. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was choked. "Mom, I didn't come to ask for anything. I just came to thank you for not giving up on me, even when it seemed I didn't deserve it." Those words were like a balm to my heart. I'd waited years to hear something like that from him. We sat in my small living room, which now had a cozy feel with my plants, the new armchair, and Lucky the cat sleeping on the couch. Randall looked around and said he'd never seen me look so good. I smiled because it was true. I didn't have riches, but I did have peace, and he finally recognized that. For the first time, he didn't see me as a liability, but as his mother, a woman with her own life and dignity. We talked at length. He told me about the recovery group meetings, the friends he made there, and how he learned to embrace his own vulnerability. I listened attentively, without interrupting. When I finished, I told him I was proud, but I also made it clear that the path to change was continuous. It wasn't enough to just take a few correct steps. I needed to maintain firmness and consistency. He nodded, and I sensed he was taking my words seriously. That day, there were tears not of pain, but of relief. I cried because I saw a sparkle in Randall's eyes I hadn't seen in years. He wasn't healed, but he was in the process of rebuilding himself, and that was more than I could ask for. I felt that the heavy burden I'd carried for so long was finally being lifted to its rightful place, on his shoulders, not mine. Over time, Randall began visiting me more frequently, always respecting my space. He didn't show up unexpectedly asking for financial help, nor did he try to manipulate me. He came to share his progress, and this gradually changed our relationship. Gradually, I felt affection again when I looked at him, without the bitter mixture of anger and disappointment that had haunted me before. It was like rediscovering my son, but from a new perspective. I also became more involved in my building's community. We organized small get-togethers, exchanged food, and helped each other. These simple things gave me a sense of belonging. Life showed me that family isn't just about blood. Family is about those who respect you, who value you, who truly welcome you. This discovery sustained me when painful memories from the past still surfaced. Some family members who believed Randall and Oilia's lies reached out to me to apologize. They said they had been influenced by the gossip, but now saw the truth. I accepted their apology, but I didn't feel the need to reconnect. I learned that forgiving doesn't mean submitting again. Forgiving for me was simply letting go of the weight of hurt and moving forward. This emotional freedom was another milestone in my new phase. As for Oilia, fate provided the answers I didn't need to ask for. She was abandoned by Marcus, lost the status and luxuries she so flaunted, and found herself alone when Randall decided to move on without her. I didn't celebrate her downfall, but I didn't pity her either. I simply understood that everyone reaps what they sow, and she sowed disrespect, manipulation, and arrogance. I just watched from afar, my heart at peace for no longer being in that storm. Randall confessed to me that he thought about giving up many times, but he remembered the firm way I confronted him that night. He came to me for help. It was the first time someone told me the truth straight up, without patting me on the head, he admitted. This touched me, because I always feared he'd hate me for being tough. Discovering that toughness turned into strength for him was one of the greatest rewards I've ever received as a mother. I, in turn, began to rediscover pleasures I'd forgotten about. I took sewing classes at the community center, returned to cooking old recipes my husband loved, and even participated in a craft fair with pieces I'd made. Things that seemed small, but they showed me I still had a lot to live for. It wasn't the end of my road, it was a new beginning, and I allowed myself to enjoy it. At 63, I realized never too late to reinvent yourself. I thought it was past time to change, but I discovered that, in fact, the right time is when you decide to put yourself first. This learning gave me confidence, self-esteem, and even joy in waking up every day, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was no longer the exhausted woman who accepted crumbs in her own home. I was in charge of my life. Deep down, I realized that true overcoming wasn't just freeing myself from Randall and Oilia's exploitation. It was looking in the mirror and recognizing that I, Dela, had value, a voice, and a right to happiness. That was the most profound transformation, ceasing to be a shadow and returning to being the light in my own story. Over time, I realized that my simple life was worth more than all the luxuries I saw Randall and Oilia flaunt. In my small apartment, I felt safe. Every bill paid with my sweat represented an achievement. Every object there had been purchased by me with my effort. This brought me a different satisfaction, a sense of belonging I never felt in the big house I handed over to my son. There, I felt like a guest. Here, finally, I felt at home. My relationship with work also changed. Before, I saw my 3 jobs as nothing more than a burden to sustain an unfair situation. Now, even though it was still tiring, the effort had a different meaning. It was for me. Knowing that my hours at the supermarket, cleaning, and at the restaurant resulted in independence made me proud. Longer, I came home feeling like my energy was being drained by others. I arrived tired, yes, but at peace. During these comings and goings, I met people who became an important part of my new beginning. A cleaning client, for example, offered me free computer lessons, telling me it's never too late to learn. I accepted and started using the computer to chat with acquaintances and even to look for new opportunities. This openness to learning made me feel alive again. I wasn't just surviving old age, I was building new versions of myself. Randall, for his part, continued his journey of recovery. Each visit marked a small but significant improvement. He no longer asked me for money, nor tried to deceive me. Sometimes he simply came to share a thought, a lesson from the group, or even a relapse he'd overcome. I listened to everything, without judgment, but remaining firm in not carrying anything of his. That's how our relationship began to become more balanced, less dependent. One day, Randall brought me a simple cake, bought with his own salary. He made a point of saying, "I paid for it with my own money, Mom, because I want to give you something of what I've achieved." I smiled and cried at the same time. This gesture, which seemed small, carried enormous weight for me. For the first time in many years, I felt like he was giving me something from the heart, without expecting anything in return. It was a healing moment. Meanwhile, I was strengthening ties in the building. We organized a community paint job to paint the common areas, and there I was, paintbrush in hand, laughing with neighbors. That sense of community restored something I'd lost, the joy of living together. I realized that when you find the right people, you don't have to beg for respect. It simply exists, and that changes everything. It was in this environment that I rediscovered the joy of sharing without being exploited. Some nights I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and reflect on how my life had been turned upside down. I never imagined I'd have the courage to leave the house I'd built. Never imagined I'd be able to start over at 63. But there I was, lighter, more confident. I understood that true home isn't made of walls, but of the space you carve out to be who you truly are. Randall still struggled with the ghosts of his past, but I saw him growing up. One day, he told me he'd started saving money to pay off some old debts. He seemed proud of every step, and I learned to be proud too. Not because he was finally doing what I'd always wanted, but because it was now his choice. I no longer pushed, no longer carried. I just watched, hoping for the best, but knowing he was the one who had to lead. During this process, I began to rediscover my self-esteem. I got a different haircut, bought new clothes within my means, and even started wearing lipstick on Sundays again. Looking in the mirror and liking myself was a feeling I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about vanity. It was about self-respect. I stopped seeing myself as just a sacrificing mother and started seeing myself as a woman again. It was liberating. The painful memories still came back, especially when I thought about Oilia's words that night of the broken plate. But now, when I remembered them, it no longer hurt as much as before. I understood that those words spoke more about her than me. I wasn't useless. I never had been. On the contrary, I had been the strength that sustained that family for years. And now I was the strength that sustained myself. This clarity was like medicine. I developed a sincere friendship with Sarah. She always told me she admired my courage and that I served as an inspiration. Hearing this moved me, because I'd never seen myself as brave. I'd always thought of myself as someone who simply did what I had to do to survive. But over time, I realized that leaving that house was indeed an act of courage, perhaps the greatest of my life. And accepting this, recognition was part of my healing process. Every step I took in this new phase proved I'd made the right decision. As difficult as it had been, leaving that house and starting from scratch saved me. I regained my voice, my space, and, most importantly, my identity. I was no longer a shadow within a home that didn't belong to me. I was the protagonist of my own life. As the months passed, my small apartment began to transform. Once empty and dull, it now had a life of its own. The walls were adorned with simple paintings I'd made myself in craft classes. The shelves held books I'd borrowed from the community library. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning filled every corner. I looked at that space and felt proud. It was modest, but it reflected who I was. And for the first time in a long time, I recognized myself in the place where I lived. Randall was increasingly showing signs of change. One day, he showed up with a notebook full of notes. He said he was recording every victory, every difficulty, and every goal he wanted to achieve. "I'm trying to learn discipline, Mom," he told me, his eyes welling up. That surprised me. I never imagined seeing my son seeking self-discovery like this. It was a clear sign that he was finally taking seriously the chance to rebuild his life. I also realized that my relationship with him had changed from the inside out. There was no longer that burden of pressure, neither on my part nor on his. Now we spoke as equals, each minding our own business. This didn't erase the past, but it allowed us to create a different present. For the first time, I felt I could look at Randall without resentment, only with hope. Meanwhile, Oilia had almost completely disappeared from my life. I heard rumors that she'd moved to another city, trying to start over on her own. I didn't bother to confirm. There was no longer room for her in my story. What she once said and did to me doesn't define who I am. Carrying that weight would only slow me down, and I was no longer willing to carry other people's burdens. I closed that door without looking back. In the community, I became seen as trustworthy. Neighbors sought me out for advice, to share problems, and this gave me a sense of purpose. I never thought that, at 63, I could reinvent myself like this. But there I was, feeling useful in a healthy way, without exploitation, simply for the value of human exchange. It was the kind of recognition I always dreamed of receiving at home, but which I found elsewhere. Some family members who had previously believed Randall's lies began to approach me again. This time, I set boundaries. I welcomed them politely, but I didn't allow them to invade my space with judgments or demands. I learned that love must go hand in hand with respect, and without respect, there can be no healthy relationship. This was one of the most important lessons I learned from everything that happened. My emotional health also improved. I, who previously lived with silent anxiety attacks, began to breathe better. The simple act of walking around the neighborhood, greeting neighbors, caring for my plants and my cat became a daily therapy. I discovered that happiness isn't about having a lot, but about having peace. And peace is something no one can give except ourselves when we choose the right life. Randall, in one of our conversations, thanked me for not backing down when he came to me in despair. He said that if I had given in, he would have continued to sing. "You were firm, Mom, and that's what saved me," he said. Hearing that was like receiving an invisible hug. For so many years, I felt guilty, as if I had failed as a mother. Now I realized that by standing up, I had finally fulfilled the most difficult role, teaching my son to take responsibility for himself. I started making small plans, but they filled me with enthusiasm. I wanted to travel to a nearby city, see places I'd never had time to visit. I wanted to dance again, even if it was in community classes for seniors. I was no longer stuck in the idea that life was over for me. On the contrary, I felt there was still so much to live. This gave me the energy to get out of bed every day with a smile. A major milestone was when I was able to fully pay off my husband's medical debt. I remember going to the bank, and as I signed the last payment, I felt tears well up. It was like ending a cycle of pain. I no longer owed anyone anything. I was free, financially and emotionally. I left with my head held high, breathing deeply, as if a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Randall accompanied me that day. He said, "Mom, today you healed a wound. Now just walk lightly." I smiled and replied that it wasn't just me who needed to walk lightly, but him too. From then on, each of us would have to forge our own path, without relying on the other as a crutch. This clarity was crucial to maintaining a healthy relationship. We were no longer prisoners of unrealistic expectations. When I got home that night, I sat in my favorite armchair with Lucky on my lap and reflected on how much my life had changed in such a short time. If anyone had told me that, at 63, I would have the courage to abandon everything and start over, I would have laughed. But there I was, experiencing exactly that. And more than surviving, I was being reborn. Randall began visiting me on regular days, and this brought stability to our relationship. He always came with updates on his treatment, sometimes accompanied by a support group member. I welcomed them with coffee and simple cake, and my kitchen table became the stage for honest conversations about mistakes, setbacks, and triumphs. Hearing those stories made me realize that my son was not alone, and that there was a whole world of people fighting silent battles, just like his. I also started talking more about myself with him. Before, our conversations revolved around his needs, but now I shared my small victories, my sewing lessons, the cat I was mischievous about, the neighbors who brought me joy. Randall listened attentively, something rare in the past. This made me feel like he finally saw me as a person, not just a support system. It was one of the biggest signs that our relationship was changing. One of the most memorable moments happened when he truly apologized to me for the first time. It wasn't a quick, superficial apology. He looked me in the eyes, held my hands, and told me he deeply regretted everything he'd put me through. He cried and I cried with him, not because those tears erased years of pain, but because they showed he finally understood the weight of his actions. It healed an old wound in my heart. Despite this, I knew I couldn't delude myself. Randall's recovery was fragile and required vigilance. I made it clear that I forgave him, but I wouldn't forget. And above all, I wouldn't allow him to exploit me again. This boundary became a pillar in our relationship. It wasn't a wall of rejection, but a line of respect. He understood and, to my surprise, agreed. It was the first time I felt there was maturity between us. While Randall was rebuilding himself, I continued to reinvent myself. I participated in a craft fair with my sewing and sold some pieces. I returned home with little money, but immense pride. I, who had always worked hard for others, now saw something made with my own hands being valued. This feeling of recognition was unforgettable. I discovered that I could still dream, I could still produce, I could still feel useful. Little by little, I began to attract new people into my life. I met women who had also experienced family difficulties and who, like me, had reinvented themselves after turning 60. Together, we formed an informal support group where we exchanged experiences and words of encouragement. There, I realized that my story was not unique. Many mothers carry burdens that are not theirs, and many find courage late, but they do. This network of friendships became a foundation. Randall watched this transformation and, at times, even expressed surprise. "Mom, I never thought you were so strong," he said one day. I smiled and replied that I didn't even know how strong I was until I was forced to use it. The truth is, we only discover what we're capable of when we're pushed to the limit. And in that limit, I found not only resilience but also a new meaning in life. Over time, I realized I was no longer afraid of aging. Before, I saw old age as synonymous with dependence, as if it were a time of losing everything. Now, I understood it was a time of choices. I could choose to live trapped in the past or build something new. I chose the new. This shift in mindset was like opening a window after years in a dark room. Light entered, and I never wanted to live in the shadows again. Randall also changed the way he saw me. He no longer treated me as if I were fragile or incapable, but as someone who inspired him. This was unexpected and, in a way, beautiful. He started calling me to ask for life advice, not money advice. Sometimes he'd ask me how I dealt with loneliness, how I maintained my strength. I'd answer honestly, "Loneliness hurts, but it's better than living surrounded by people who belittle you." And he seemed to reflect on this. At this point, I received a special invitation to speak at a community gathering about my experience. At first, I was shy, thinking my story valuable enough. But when I began to tell it, I saw attentive and emotional eyes listening to me. Some women cried, others smiled, and everyone hugged me at the end. I realized that my pain had become a learning experience and my learning could become inspiration. It was a transformative feeling. That night, I returned home feeling light. I sat on the porch with my cup of tea and thought, if I had stayed in that house, I might never have discovered my strength. That phrase echoed in I had not only survived my son's emotional abandonment and my daughter-in-law's insults, but I had been reborn as a whole person. This reassured me that even after so much pain, life always offers new opportunities. And that's how I understood that my journey wasn't just about leaving a house or facing injustice. It was about finding myself again. I, Dela Morrison, went from being the invisible woman to someone who truly lives. Over time, I began to realize that I no longer Randall and Oilia as an open wound. The past was there, of course, but it didn't hurt like it used to. It was just a memory that reminded me of where I came from and where I never wanted to go back. The hurt turned into a learning experience. I learned to set boundaries. I learned to accept nothing less than I deserved. And that became part of who I am now. Randall still had his ups and downs, but I could see he was committed. One day he appeared proudly, showing me a small savings account he'd started to build. "It's not much, Mom, but it's mine," he said. I held that little notebook in my hands and felt something I hadn't felt in years. True hope. He was no longer the man who drained my strength. He was learning to support himself, to stand up for himself. And that was already worth more than any luxury he'd once flaunted. While he was rebuilding, I was also making my own breakthroughs. I managed to reduce my workload by quitting one of my jobs. Now I only worked 2 jobs, which time for myself. I used this time to cook, sew, walk, and even rest without guilt. This change seems small, but for me it was huge. After years of killing myself working for others, I finally learned to work to live, not just live to work. In the building, I became a beacon of strength. People called me over to talk, asking my opinion. A younger neighbor said she wanted to be like me when she reached my age. Independent, strong, but also generous. These words touched me deeply. I never thought anyone would see me as a role model. I, who had so often felt weak, now inspired others. It was as if life were returning to me in recognition of everything I had suffered in silence. I even received an invitation to help with a group of women who met to talk about their struggles. I accepted with trepidation, but soon realized how much it did me good. Sharing my story wasn't just about venting. It was about showing that it was possible to start over. Each woman who thanked me for my words reminded me that pain doesn't have to be the end of the line. It can be the beginning of a new path. Randall watched all of this closely. He said he was inspired by my courage, and I saw the sincerity in his eyes. Our relationship, once marked by hurt and exploitation, now had room for genuine affection. I didn't expect it to be perfect, and it never will be. But I was pleased to have rediscovered a healthy way of being a mother, present but not dependent, loving but not submissive. Day 1. He arrived with a surprise. He brought me a framed photo of us smiling together in my apartment. "I want you to always remember that I'm trying to be a better son," he said. I placed the photo on the shelf next to the picture of my husband, and I felt like this was a new page in our story, a page I never imagined would exist, but which was finally beginning to be written. I also learned to value my moments of solitude. Before, I feared being alone. Now, I saw it as a gift. I could choose how to spend my time. I could hear my own voice. I could rest without the weight of judgment. Solitude stopped being abandonment and became freedom. It was one of the greatest gifts I received from this new phase of life. It was during this period that I realized how different I was, even physically. People said I looked younger, lighter. Not that the wrinkles had disappeared, but the weight of sadness had lifted, and this was reflected on my face. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who truly smiled again, and that smile was mine, not borrowed, not forced. I was asked a few times if I would have the courage to return to my old house, if Randall recovered everything and offered me space. The answer was always clear: no. That cycle had closed. My place was now the simple apartment I had earned with my own hands. There lay my story of overcoming adversity. There lay my freedom. There was no reason to go back. The past had taught me, but it no longer held me back. I also didn't harbor hatred toward Oilia. What she did to me was cruel, but carrying that resentment would only hurt me. I hope she finds her way, far from me. My heart no longer has room for that kind of burden. I prefer to fill my days with peace and gratitude for the people who truly matter. This keeps me strong and gives me the peace to move forward. One day, I sat on the porch with Lucky curled up at my feet and realized how much I had changed. I thought about everything I'd experienced, the sleepless nights, the humiliations, the moment I left with only a suitcase, and I compared it to where I was now. I felt pride, not shame. I wasn't defeated. I'd risen, and in a way I never thought I could. That feeling was the greatest victory of my life. One day, I was invited to speak at a larger community gathering, attended by people of all ages. I was nervous, but I accepted. I told my story, from the loss of my husband to the moment I decided to leave my son's house. As I spoke, I noticed emotional faces, some even crying. At the end, I received applause and hugs. It was at that moment that I understood. My pain had become strength not only for myself, but for others as well. After that encounter, I was frequently called upon to speak with younger women who were experiencing emotional abuse or exploitation within their own families. I listened patiently, offered advice, and, above all, demonstrated with my own life that there is always a way out. I never imagined being seen as a role, but that role filled me with purpose. I felt useful in a way I had never experienced before. Randall was proud to see me this way. He even said to me, "Mom, I thought you were fragile, but I've discovered you're the strongest person I know." These words resonated deeply with me, not because I needed his approval, but because they represented the recognition I'd always hoped for. He finally saw me for who I was, not the caricature of a provider who supported his choices. This changed the way I saw myself. While I flourished, Randall continued to struggle. There were setbacks, yes, but he always came to tell me. I listened, and instead of judging him, I asked him what he learned from it. Unlike in the past, he no longer tried to hide behind excuses. He owned his mistakes and sought ways to avoid repeating them. It was painful to see my son struggle, but at the same time, it was beautiful to witness his courage in facing his own failures. It was during this period that I realized I was no longer afraid of the future. Before, each day was uncertain, a burden. Now, each day was an opportunity. I woke up energized, thinking about simple but valuable things, cooking something new, tending to the plants, visiting friends, chatting with neighbors. I discovered that happiness doesn't require great feats, just the right choices. And I was finally choosing for myself. One afternoon, Randall asked me to accompany him to an open support group meeting. I sat among strangers, tough but courageous stories. When it was his turn, Randall spoke about me. He said his greatest inspiration was his mother, who didn't give up but who also didn't support him in his mistakes. I was moved to hear him. He didn't present me as a savior, but as a mirror of strength. This made me feel fulfilled. After that meeting, several people came up to thank me for being there. Some said they wanted to be like me when they grew older, that I showed them there's always a chance to start over. I left with a warm heart. I, who had once been humiliated in my own home, was now a source of respect in a place full of people. It was as if life had turned a corner for me, definitively. I started planning short trips. Nothing grand, just trips to neighboring towns to explore local markets, fairs, and squares. Each trip was a gift I gave myself. I no longer needed to ask permission. I no longer needed to justify my expenses. It was me making decisions for myself and for myself. These small adventures made me realize there was still so much to live for, even after 60. It was as if the world had opened up before my eyes again. Randall, during his visit, seemed happy to see this new version of me. He said my independence also motivated him to stay strong in his recovery. "If you could rebuild yourself after everything, why couldn't I?" he'd ask. and I always replied that the strength was within him. It just needed to be used. These conversations brought us closer than ever, but without the suffocating dependence of before. In this new phase, even my relationship with my husband's memory changed. Before, I remembered him with sadness, carrying the weight of debt and suffering. Now, I remembered him with gratitude for the good memories and what we built together. I kept his photo in the most visible place in the living room, next to the frame Randall gave me. It was my way of honoring the past, but without being trapped by it. The present was mine, and I was living it fully. One day, while tending my plants on the porch, I thought about how different everything might have been if I hadn't had the courage to leave that house. Maybe I would have gotten sick, maybe my life would have ended quietly. But no, I chose to get up, and that choice changed everything. I felt so proud that tears fell on their own. It was as if I had finally made peace with myself. And it was at that moment that I understood with clarity that my story was not just one of pain, but of victory. Not because I became rich, not because I acquired possessions, but because I conquered myself. I was no longer the shadow of an exploited mother. I was hers, whole, independent, master of my own life. As time passed, I realized I no longer held grudges, nor even sadness. What remained was a lesson learned. The pain that once crushed me became fuel for the life I led today. I am not a bitter woman. I am a woman aware of the strength she discovered within herself. That, to me, is worth more than any material comfort I ever had. Randall, though still in the process, was already a different man. He worked, supported himself, and continued to attend support meetings. Sometimes he'd call me just to share a good day, and I'd smile, because I could see that for the first time, he was learning to build happiness with his own hands. This gave me peace. I no longer felt the need to control or save him. He had found his own path, and I had found mine. One night, he visited with an unexpected gift, a small notebook in which he'd written a letter. In it, he said that everything he'd experienced was a consequence of his choices, but that the chance to start over came the moment I decided to stand up. "Mom, your courage showed me that I too could change," he wrote. I cried when I read it, because I never imagined my decision to leave that house would have such a profound impact. It was at that moment that I understood. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to seek revenge. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. My greatest test was in my own life. By choosing myself, I taught without words, and that teaching somehow saved not only me, but also my son. This realization was the greatest gift I received. The community continued to bring me joy. I officially joined the women's group and even organized a small charity fair with others. I never thought I'd have the strength to lead anything, but there I was, smiling among so many people, feeling like I was part of something bigger. I discovered there's always room for a new beginning, even after 60. One afternoon, I sat on the porch and remembered the night I was called a useless old woman. The memory didn't hurt. On the contrary, it made me smile. Because if I hadn't felt that shock that night, I might never have mustered the courage to leave. It was the humiliation that led to my liberation. And today, looking back, I no longer feel ashamed. I feel gratitude for having turned that a turning point. Randall still told me from time to time that he loved me. Those words, which had once seemed empty, now carried weight. He spoke with truth, with respect, and I responded in kind. We weren't perfect, but we were real. Our relationship was no longer one of exploitation, but of choice, and that was the biggest change of all. With Lucky on my lap and a cup of tea in my hand, I often reflected on what it meant to win. For me, Winning wasn't about accumulating wealth or having the perfect life. Winning was being able to look in the mirror and like what I saw. It was sleeping peacefully, knowing I owed no one anything. It was waking up without fear, ready to live another day. That was victory. There were days when I still cried, but they were no longer tears of pain. They were tears of relief, of pride, of recognition for the journey I had made. Every mark of the past became a reminder of resilience, and each memory showed me that I had survived what many would have thought impossible. In the end, I realized that my greatest achievement wasn't just leaving that house, nor seeing Randall change. My greatest achievement was rebuilding myself. I gave myself the chance to be reborn when everyone thought I was finished. I didn't limit myself to the role of mother, nor to the role of widow. I am hers, a whole, complete living woman. Today, when I walk the streets of my neighborhood and am greeted with affection by neighbors and friends, I feel I've found my place in the world. I don't need applause or grand recognition. My victory lies in my daily life, in the serenity I carry, in the certainty that I chose myself. And that's how I want to end my story, by saying that it's never too late to get up. It's never too late to say enough and start over. I did this at 63, with fear, with tears, but with courage. And it was this courage that gave me my life back. If someone hears my story and feels they can change too, then everything I've experienced will have been worth it.